Hey there. Before we dive into this incredible story that will absolutely blow your mind, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're ready for a story about someone who changed an entire system with just one brave decision, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a nurse who proved that sometimes the smallest person in the room can move the biggest mountains. Let's begin. The fluorescent lights of Northwestern Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across the emergency department floor as Sarah Martinez hurried between patient rooms, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum. At 29, she had already spent 7 years navigating the labyrinthine politics of Chicago's most prestigious medical center, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of institutional prejudice pressed down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Martinez, the sharp voice of Susan Miller, the nursing supervisor, cut through the controlled chaos of the ER. Sarah looked up from the patient chart she was reviewing, her dark eyes meeting the cold stare of the woman who seemed to take pleasure in making her life difficult. "Yes, Miss Miller," Sarah responded, maintaining the professional tone that had become second nature after years of subtle harassment. Susan approached, her heels clicking with authority, followed by Dr. Charles Morrison, the medical director whose reputation for prioritizing profit over patients was an open secret among the staff. The two made quite a pair. Susan with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer scrubs that somehow never seemed to get dirty, and Dr. Morrison in his expensive suit that cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. "We need to discuss your intervention with the Henderson case last week, Doctor," Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of condescension that made Sarah's jaw clench involuntarily. Sarah straightened her spine. The Henderson case, an elderly man who had come in with chest pains, but whose insurance had been denied. She had pushed for additional tests that revealed a serious cardiac condition requiring immediate treatment. "I saved his life," she said simply. "You exceeded your authority," Susan snapped. "Nurses don't make medical decisions. They follow orders. And you cost this hospital thousands of dollars in unauthorized procedures," Dr. Morrison added, adjusting his gold watch with casual cruelty. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a community clinic, Martinez, somewhere more suited to your background." The words hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she had learned long ago to channel that fire into something more useful than rage. She came from the South Side, from a family where her grandmother cleaned these very hospital floors for 30 years. Every day, she walked through halls where people looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong, someone who should be grateful for the opportunity to work among her betters. "I follow medical ethics," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside. "Every patient deserves quality care, regardless of their insurance status." "Doctor," Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "How admirable, how naive." He stepped closer, invading her personal space with practiced intimidation. "This is Northwestern Memorial, not a charity clinic. We serve patients who can afford our services. If you can't understand that basic business principle, perhaps you should reconsider your career choices." Around them, other staff members had begun to take notice of the confrontation. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others disapproving, all of them afraid to speak up. This was how the system worked: maintain the hierarchy, protect the profitable patients, and keep the idealistic troublemakers in line. "Dr. Morrison," a new voice interrupted. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of emergency medicine, approached the group with purposeful strides. "Is there a problem here?" Dr. Morrison's expression shifted slightly, the practiced smile of hospital politics sliding into place. "Just discussing protocols with Nurse Martinez. Nothing that concerns you, Elena." Dr. Rodriguez's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back to Morrison. There was no love lost between the two physicians. Rodriguez had built her reputation on clinical excellence and patient advocacy, while Morrison had climbed the administrative ladder through cost-cutting and political maneuvering. "Actually," Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying quiet authority, "since we're discussing the Henderson case, I should mention that Nurse Martinez's intervention prevented what would have been a wrongful death lawsuit. Her clinical judgment was exceptional. Susan's face flushed with barely controlled anger. The protocols exist for a reason. The protocols exist to cover the hospital's financial interests, Dr. Rodriguez interrupted smoothly. Patient care should always come first. Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened. We'll continue this discussion later, he said to Sarah, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat. I trust you'll have time to reflect on your priorities. As the two administrators walked away, their voices carrying in heated whispers, Dr. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. You did the right thing, she said quietly. Don't let them make you doubt that. Sarah nodded, grateful for the support but knowing it wouldn't protect her from the consequences. She had been marked now, labeled as a troublemaker, in a system that valued compliance over compassion. But as she returned to her patients, she carried with her the memory of Mr. Henderson's wife crying with relief when told her husband would survive. Some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds were stacked against you. But Sarah Martinez had no idea that her greatest test was still to come, and it would arrive with the screaming sirens of an ambulance, carrying a patient who would change everything she thought she knew about power, justice, and the true meaning of courage. 3 years earlier, the cramped apartment on Chicago's South Side buzzed with nervous energy as Sarah Martinez adjusted her cap and gown for the last time. Through the thin walls, she could hear Mrs. Gonzalez's baby crying next door and the distant hum of traffic on State Street. It was a world away from the pristine halls of Northwestern Memorial, but it was home. Mija, you sure you want to work at that fancy place? Her grandmother, Rosa Martinez, asked from her wheelchair by the window. At 78, Rosa's hands were gnarled from decades of cleaning hospital floors, but her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had guided Sarah through every challenge of her life. Sarah knelt beside her grandmother's chair, taking those weathered hands in her own. Abuela, you cleaned those floors for 30 years. Now I get to walk them as a nurse. That's progress. Rosa's laugh was warm, but tinged with worry. Aye, but they won't see you as a nurse, Mija. They'll see a girl from the barrio who doesn't know her place. It was a conversation they'd had many times during Sarah's nursing school years. Rosa had worked at Northwestern Memorial since Sarah was a child, invisible to the doctors and administrators who passed her in the hallways. She had seen the hierarchy, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways the system reminded people like them that they were lucky to be there at all. Tell me again why you chose nursing, Rosa said, settling back in her chair. Sarah smiled, remembering. Because of you, Abuela. Remember when I was 8 and got that fever? You couldn't afford to take me to the doctor, so you sat by my bed for 3 days straight, cooling my forehead, making sure I drank water, watching over me like a guardian angel. You saved my life with compassion and knowledge. That's when I knew. The memory was crystal clear. Rosa mixing homemade remedies with modern medicine she'd learned from overhearing doctors and nurses during her decades of work. The combination of traditional healing wisdom and medical knowledge had fascinated young Sarah, planting the seed that would grow into her calling. And what did I always tell you about helping people? Rosa prompted. That it doesn't matter if they can pay or not, if they speak English or Spanish, if they wear expensive clothes or rags, Sarah recited. When someone is suffering, you help. Period. Rosa nodded approvingly. The doctors and nurses, they like to forget I was there when they talked. I heard things, Mija. I heard how they talked about patients without insurance, about people who looked like us. Promise me you'll never become like them. Promise me you'll remember where you come from. Sarah had made that promise, and it had guided her through every difficult day of nursing school. When classmates from wealthier backgrounds formed study groups and social circles that somehow never included her, when professors questioned whether she truly belonged in the program, when financial stress nearly forced her to drop out, through it all, she held onto her grandmother's wisdom and her own burning desire to heal. 2 years earlier, the memory shifted to Sarah's first day at Northwestern Memorial. The gleaming lobby with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers intimidated her, but she thought of Rosa, scrubbing those marble floors on her hands and knees, and straightened her shoulders. You must be the new nurse, a voice had said behind her. Sarah turned to see Dr. Elena Rodriguez, then just an attending physician in emergency medicine. Even then, Rodriguez had possessed the kind of quiet confidence that commanded respect. Yes, ma'am. Sarah Martinez. Dr. Rodriguez studied her with intelligent eyes. From the south side? Sarah braced herself for the usual reaction, the subtle shift in expression that said charity case or diversity hire. Instead, Dr. Rodriguez smiled. Good. We need more people here who understand what it means to fight for something. Most of the staff has never had to struggle for anything in their lives. They've forgotten that medicine is about serving people, not the other way around. It was the beginning of a mentorship that would shape Sarah's approach to nursing. Dr. Rodriguez taught her not just clinical skills, but how to navigate the political waters of hospital administration, how to advocate for patients without making enemies, and how to maintain her principles in a system designed to erode them. The secret, Doctor, Rodriguez had told her during one late-night shift, is to be so good at what you do that they can't ignore you. Competence is the great equalizer. Master your craft, and they'll have to respect you, even if they don't want to. Sarah had taken that advice to heart, throwing herself into every aspect of nursing with fierce dedication. She studied constantly, volunteered for the most difficult cases, and gradually built a reputation among the medical staff as someone who could be trusted with complex patients. But the administration never quite warmed to her, especially after she began questioning cost-cutting measures that affected patient care. 1 year earlier, the breaking point had come during the winter flu outbreak. The hospital had been overwhelmed with patients, many of them uninsured immigrants from Sarah's neighborhood. The administration had implemented a new policy: stabilize and transfer. Get the uninsured patients stable enough to move, then send them to public hospitals where they would become someone else's financial problem. Sarah had watched patient after patient being loaded into ambulances while still critically ill, knowing that some of them wouldn't survive the transfer. When she raised concerns, she was told to focus on her job and leave policy decisions to the administrators. That night, she had gone home to find Rosa watching the local news. A report was covering the death of a young father who had been transferred from Northwestern Memorial to Cook County Hospital too late to save his life. He had left behind a wife and 3 children. "Did you know him, Abuela?" Sarah had asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Manuel Reyes. He worked construction with your cousin Roberto. Good man, good father." Rosa's voice was heavy with grief and anger. "This is what I was afraid of, mija. This is what happens when you try to change a system that doesn't want to be changed." Sarah had cried that night, for Manuel Reyes, for his family, for all the patients she couldn't save. But by morning, her tears had crystallized into something harder and more useful: determination. She would not be complicit in a system that valued profit over human life. She would not let her grandmother's 30 years of service, her own years of study and sacrifice, be wasted on an institution that had forgotten its fundamental purpose. She would find a way to fight back, even if it meant standing alone against the entire system. As Sarah sat in the present moment, preparing for another shift at Northwestern Memorial, she carried with her the weight of all those memories, all those promises, all those hard-won lessons about justice and compassion. She had no way of knowing that in just a few hours, a young man's life would hang in the balance, and she would face the ultimate test of everything she believed in. The choice that lay ahead would cost her everything she had worked for, and give her something far more precious in return. The night shift at Northwestern Memorial had settled into its familiar rhythm when the paramedics burst through the emergency room doors at 2:47 a.m. Their radios had been crackling with updates during the 10-minute ride from Lincoln Park, where they'd found an unconscious young man beneath an overpass, blood pooling beneath his head on the concrete. Male, approximately 25 to 30 years old, found unconscious with severe head trauma, the lead paramedic called out as they wheeled the gurney toward Trauma Bay 3. Possible subdural hematoma, pupils reactive but sluggish, vitals stable but concerning. Sarah Martinez looked up from the medication cart she was restocking and immediately moved into action. This was her domain, the critical moments where her years of training and natural instincts combined to save lives. She quickly assessed the scene. The patient's clothes were dirty and worn, typical of someone living on the streets. No identification, no wallet, no emergency contacts. "What's his story?" Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the attending physician, asked as she pulled on her gloves. "Anonymous tip called it in around 2 a.m., the paramedic replied. "Found him under the North Avenue Bridge. Could be a fall, could be assault. No witnesses." Sarah moved to the patient's side, beginning her rapid assessment. Despite the grime and blood, she could see he was young, probably late 20s, with dark hair and strong features. More importantly, her experienced eye caught details that others might miss. His teeth were straight and well-maintained, his hands showed no signs of long-term malnutrition, and beneath the dirty clothes she glimpsed what appeared to be high-quality fabric. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah said quietly. "His pupils are becoming more sluggish. We need to get him to radiology immediately." Before Dr. Walsh could respond, the familiar click of expensive heels announced the arrival of Susan Miller. The nursing supervisor appeared at the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand, her expression already hardening as she took in the patient's appearance. "What do we have here?" Susan asked, though her tone suggested she had already reached her conclusions. "Head trauma, probable subdural hematoma," Dr. Walsh replied, focused on her examination. "Insurance information?" "None found," the paramedic answered. "No ID, no wallet, nothing." Susan's lips pursed with distaste. "I see. Well, Dr. Walsh, you know the protocol. Stabilize and transfer to Cook County. We're not a charity hospital." Sarah felt her jaw clench, but she kept her voice professional. "Ms. Miller, this patient needs immediate neurosurgical intervention." "A transfer could what, Martinez?" Susan interrupted. "Are you a doctor now? Are you qualified to make medical decisions?" Dr. Walsh looked up from her examination, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to challenge the administration directly. Like many physicians at Northwestern Memorial, she had learned to navigate the politics by avoiding conflict with the business side of the hospital. "The patient does appear to need more extensive care, Doctor," Walsh said carefully. "But if the insurance situation is as Ms. Miller suggests—" "It's exactly as I suggest," Susan replied curtly. "This is a business decision, not a medical one. Get him stable and transfer him out. We have paying patients who need these resources." Sarah watched as Dr. Walsh reluctantly nodded, the weight of institutional pressure overriding her medical judgment. It was a scene that played out regularly at Northwestern Memorial, the slow, systematic dehumanization of patients who couldn't pay, wrapped in the language of fiscal responsibility and protocol. But as Sarah looked down at the unconscious young man, something stirred in her chest. Call it intuition, call it defiance, call it the ghost of her grandmother's voice, reminding her that every life had value, regardless of the contents of their wallet. This patient was different somehow, and not just because of the subtle incongruities she had noticed. "Miss Miller," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "I'd like to request a neurosurgical consult before any transfer decisions are made." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Around the trauma bay, other staff members had begun to notice the confrontation. This was dangerous territory. Challenging the nursing supervisor in front of the medical staff was career suicide at Northwestern Memorial. "You'd like to request?" Susan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Nurse Martinez, I don't think you understand your position here. You don't request consultations, you don't make medical decisions, you follow orders and procedures. Is that clear?" Sarah's mind raced. She thought of Manuel Reyes, the construction worker who had died after being transferred too soon. She thought of her grandmother's weathered hands and 30 years of invisible service. She thought of every patient who had been written off because they didn't fit the hospital's financial profile. "Crystal clear, Ms. Miller," Sarah replied, "but as the primary nurse for this patient, I have a professional obligation to advocate for appropriate care. Doctor." Walsh shifted uncomfortably, caught between her medical ethics and her career ambitions. "Perhaps we could compromise," she suggested weakly. "A quick CT scan before transfer, just to be safe." "Absolutely not," Susan snapped. "The protocol is clear, and it exists for good reasons. This hospital cannot function as a charity case repository for every homeless person in Chicago." As if summoned by the tension, Dr. Charles Morrison appeared at the entrance to the trauma bay. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the room. Staff members straightened, voices lowered, and the air crackled with the kind of nervous energy that powerful people brought with them. "What seems to be the problem here?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Susan quickly briefed him on the situation, emphasizing the patient's lack of insurance and Sarah's inappropriate advocacy. Doctor. Morrison listened with the kind of patient attention that preceded decisive action. "I see," he said finally, his gaze settling on Sarah with unmistakable displeasure. "Nurse Martinez, we discussed this very issue just last week, didn't we? Your tendency to exceed your authority?" Sarah met his stare without flinching. "Dr. Morrison, this patient has signs of increased intracranial pressure. Without immediate intervention, he'll become Cook County's problem instead of ours," Dr. Morrison interrupted, "which is exactly where he belongs. This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital, not a homeless shelter." The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air like smoke. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues, some avoiding her eyes, others watching with a mixture of sympathy and fear. This was the moment of truth, the point where she could either fall in line with the system or take a stand that would change everything. In the bed between them, the young man's breathing remained steady but shallow, his life hanging in the balance while bureaucrats debated his worth. Sarah thought of her grandmother's words, "When someone is suffering, you help. Period." "Doctor." "Morrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her, "I formally request a neurosurgical consultation for this patient. If my concerns prove unfounded, I'll accept full responsibility. But if I'm right and we transfer him without proper treatment, we'll have blood on our hands." The challenge was unmistakable, delivered in front of witnesses who would remember this moment for years to come. "Doctor." Morrison's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "What's the nature of the head injury?" Everyone turned to see Dr. Miguel Santos, the chief of neurosurgery, standing in the doorway. His arrival was unexpected. Neurosurgeons rarely made unscheduled appearances in the emergency department, especially during night shifts. "Dr. Santos," Dr. Morrison said, his tone immediately shifting to diplomatic courtesy. "Just a minor consultation issue, nothing that requires your attention." But Dr. Santos was already moving toward the patient, his experienced eye taking in details that others had missed. "Nurse Martinez," Sarah supplied quickly. "Nurse Martinez, what are your concerns?" Sarah felt every eye in the room on her as she outlined her observations, the pupil responses, the subtle changes in the patient's breathing pattern, the signs of increasing intracranial pressure that her trained eye had detected. Dr. Santos listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands gently examining the patient's head. Finally, he straightened and looked directly at Dr. Morrison. "This patient needs immediate surgery," he said simply. "Nurse Martinez is absolutely correct. If we wait for a transfer, he'll be dead within the hour." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and terror. She had been right about the medical situation, but she had also just humiliated the hospital's medical director in front of the entire emergency department staff. "Doctor." Morrison's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "Dr. Santos, surely we can discuss the hospital's policies regarding uninsured patients." "The only policy I care about is saving lives," Dr. Santos interrupted. "Prep or two. We're going up now." As the trauma team sprang into action, preparing the patient for emergency surgery, Dr. Morrison leaned close to Sarah's ear. "This isn't over, Martinez," he whispered. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Sarah watched as the unconscious young man was wheeled toward the elevator, his life now in the capable hands of Dr. Santos and his surgical team. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was just beginning. What she couldn't know was that the patient she had just saved would soon turn out to be far more than a homeless man with a head injury. His true identity would shake the very foundations of Northwestern Memorial Hospital and transform her act of medical courage into something much larger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The real fight was about to begin. The surgical suite hummed with controlled urgency as Dr. Miguel Santos prepared for what would become one of the most significant operations of his career. Under the brilliant surgical lights, the young man Sarah Martinez had fought to save lay unconscious on the operating table, his life hanging in the balance while hospital politics raged in the corridors below. Sarah stood outside OR2, still wearing her scrubs from the emergency department, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation with Dr. Morrison. She had violated every unwritten rule of hospital hierarchy, and she knew there would be consequences. But watching the surgical team work through the observation window, she felt no regret. "Quite a stand you took down there," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find Dr. Elena Rodriguez approaching, her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. As head of emergency medicine, Dr. Rodriguez had heard about the confrontation within minutes of its conclusion. "I couldn't let them transfer him," Sarah said simply. "He would have died." "You're probably right, Dr. Rodriguez agreed, joining her at the observation window. "Miguel doesn't take cases lightly. If he says the surgery was necessary, it was necessary." Inside the operating room, Dr. Santos worked with the precision and grace that had made him one of the most respected neurosurgeons in Chicago. His team moved around him like a well-choreographed dance, each member knowing their role in the delicate operation to relieve the pressure on their patient's brain. "Nurse Martinez, Doctor." Santos's voice came through the intercom. "Could you join us? I could use your assessment skills up here." Sarah looked at Dr. Rodriguez in surprise. It was highly unusual for an emergency room nurse to be invited into neurosurgery, especially during such a critical operation. "Go," Dr. Rodriguez urged. "Miguel doesn't make requests like that lightly." Minutes later, Sarah found herself scrubbed in and standing beside one of Chicago's most prestigious surgeons as he carefully opened the patient's skull to relieve the pressure that threatened his life. The subdural hematoma was even more severe than the scans had indicated. Without immediate intervention, the patient would have suffered irreversible brain damage or death. "Your eyes are excellent," Dr. Santos murmured as he worked. "Most emergency staff would have missed the subtle signs you caught. Where did you train?" "Chicago Community College Nursing Program," Sarah replied, her attention focused on monitoring the patient's vital signs. Dr. Santos glanced up briefly, his eyes registering surprise. "CCC. That's unusual for Northwestern Memorial staff." Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment. Most of her colleagues had attended prestigious nursing schools, their paths smoothed by family connections and financial resources she had never possessed. "I worked 3 jobs to pay for school," she said quietly. "It took me 6 years instead of 4. "And that dedication shows in your work," Dr. Santos replied matter-of-factly. "Some of the best medical professionals I've known came from humble beginnings. They understand what it means to fight for something." As the surgery progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into the intricate work of neurosurgery. Dr. Santos explained each step, teaching her about brain anatomy and surgical techniques with the patience of a born educator. For nearly 3 hours she worked alongside him, her natural instincts and careful training making her a valuable addition to the surgical team. "Beautiful work, Doctor," Santos announced as he placed the final sutures. "This young man is going to make a full recovery, thanks to your intervention downstairs." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. In the harsh, fluorescent lighting of the OR, she could see the patient's face more clearly now that it had been cleaned. He looked peaceful, almost serene, and definitely younger than they had initially estimated, probably mid to late 20s. "Who do you think he is?" asked Dr. Sarah Kim, the anesthesiologist, as they prepared to move the patient to intensive care. "Could be anyone," Dr. Santos replied. "The streets don't discriminate. I've operated on everyone from professors to construction workers who ended up homeless due to circumstances beyond their control." As they wheeled the patient toward the ICU, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about this young man. The incongruities she had noticed in the emergency room still nagged at her: the quality of his dental work, the condition of his hands, subtle details that didn't quite fit the profile of someone who had been living rough for an extended period. The ICU at Northwestern Memorial was a temple of modern medicine, filled with the latest monitoring equipment and staffed by the hospital's most experienced critical care nurses. As they settled the patient into his bed, Sarah took responsibility for his initial post-operative care, checking his vital signs and adjusting the various machines that would monitor his recovery. "I'll stay with him for the first few hours," Sarah told Dr. Santos. "Make sure there are no complications." Dr. Santos nodded approvingly. "Good. He's lucky to have you as his advocate." As the surgical team dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with the patient in the quiet of the ICU. The steady beeping of the heart monitor provided a reassuring rhythm, and his vital signs remained stable. The surgery had been a complete success. But even as she celebrated this medical victory, Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. By challenging Dr. Morrison and the hospital's transfer policy, she had made powerful enemies. There would be consequences, possibly severe ones, for her insubordination. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Susan Miller, who entered the ICU with the purposeful stride of someone delivering bad news. Her face was set in hard lines, and her clipboard was clutched like a weapon. "Nurse Martinez," Susan said, her voice arctic with controlled anger. "Dr. Morrison would like to see you in his office, immediately." Sarah looked at her patient, then back at Susan. "I need to monitor his post-operative condition." "As his primary nurse—" "You are no longer his primary nurse," Susan interrupted. "In fact, you are no longer employed by this hospital. Security will escort you out after your meeting with Dr. Morrison." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected consequences, but the swiftness and finality of the decision left her reeling. "You can't fire me for providing appropriate patient care. We can fire you for insubordination, for exceeding your authority, and for violating hospital protocols," Susan replied with evident satisfaction. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately." As Sarah took one last look at the patient she had fought to save, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride at having done the right thing, fear about her uncertain future, and a stubborn determination that this injustice would not be the end of her story. She had no way of knowing that the young man lying unconscious in the ICU bed was about to become the catalyst for changes that would transform not just her life, but the entire institution that had just cast her out into the cold Chicago night. The patient's identity remained a mystery, but his survival had already begun to set in motion events that would ultimately expose the corruption and greed that had infected Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and the people responsible would soon learn that some battles cost far more than they ever imagined. Dr. Morrison's office occupied a corner of the hospital's executive floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Chicago's skyline. The space was designed to intimidate. Rich mahogany furniture, prestigious medical school diplomas, and photographs with politicians and business leaders lined the walls like trophies of power and influence. Sarah Martinez sat across from his imposing desk, flanked by two security guards, whose presence made it clear that this was not a discussion, but a sentencing. Her hands remained steady in her lap, but her mind raced through the implications of what was happening. 7 years of building her career, of proving herself in this hostile environment, was about to be erased with the stroke of a pen. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done, Ms. Martinez?" Dr. Morrison asked, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute power. He had shed his earlier mask of professional courtesy, revealing the calculating administrator beneath. "I saved a man's life," Sarah replied simply. Dr. Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You cost this hospital $800,000 in unauthorized procedures. You violated direct orders from your supervisor. You undermined the chain of command in front of medical staff, creating a dangerous precedent that threatens the very structure of our institution." Susan Miller stood beside the desk, her clipboard thick with documentation. "We have statements from multiple witnesses regarding your insubordination," she added with evident satisfaction. "Your termination is not only justified, but necessary. Furthermore," Dr. Morrison continued, leaning forward with predatory intensity, "the hospital will be filing a civil lawsuit against you personally for the costs incurred by your unauthorized medical decisions. $800,000, Ms. Martinez. I hope your moment of conscience was worth bankrupting yourself and destroying your career." The threat hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt the walls of her world closing in around her. Not only was she losing her job, but they were going to pursue her financially, ensuring that she would never work in healthcare again. It was a level of vindictiveness that went far beyond institutional discipline. It was personal destruction, calculated and complete. "You can't sue me for providing appropriate medical care," Sarah said, though her voice carried less conviction than she felt. "Watch us, Doctor," Morrison replied coldly. "You exceeded your authority and made medical decisions you were not qualified to make. The financial consequences of those decisions are your responsibility." Susan stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the desk in front of Sarah. "These are the termination papers and notification of legal action. You'll need to sign acknowledging receipt." Sarah stared at the documents without touching them. 7 years of her life reduced to legal jargon and financial threats, all because she had refused to let a human being die for lack of insurance. There is, however, one alternative, Dr. Morrison said, his tone shifting to something that might have been magnanimous in a different context. If you were to publicly acknowledge your error in judgment, admit that you exceeded your authority, and agree to never work in healthcare again, we might be willing to forego the lawsuit. It was the final humiliation, demanding not just her career, but her dignity, requiring her to denounce the very principles that had guided her into nursing. Sarah thought of her grandmother, Rosa, who had cleaned these floors for 30 years while maintaining her pride and integrity. She thought of every patient she had helped, every life she had touched during her time at Northwestern Memorial. "No," she said quietly but firmly. Dr. Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. "No? I won't sign anything that says I was wrong to save a human life," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I won't apologize for doing my job as a healthcare professional. And I won't be bullied into abandoning my principles to save your reputation." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Dr. Morrison's face had darkened with fury, and Susan's mouth hung open in shock. They had expected capitulation, not defiance. "Very well," Dr. Morrison said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "Security will escort you from the building. The lawsuit will proceed, and I will personally ensure that you never work in healthcare anywhere in this city again. Do you understand me, Ms. Martinez?" Sarah stood slowly, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Perfectly, Dr. Morrison. I understand exactly what kind of man you are and what kind of institution this has become." As the security guards moved to flank her, Sarah took one last look around the office that represented everything she had been fighting against, the symbols of power and privilege that mattered more to these people than the human lives entrusted to their care. "One more thing," she said, turning back to face Dr. Morrison. "That young man upstairs? He's going to survive because of what I did tonight. Whatever happens to me, whatever you do to destroy my life, you can't change that fact. His family, his friends, the people who love him, they'll never know your names, but they'll know mine. Because I chose to save a life instead of protecting a profit margin." The security guards escorted her through the corridors she had walked as a nurse for 7 years, past the ICU where her patient was recovering, past the emergency department where she had made her stand, past the janitor's closet where her grandmother had stored her cleaning supplies for 3 decades. As they reached the lobby, Sarah passed the bronze plaque that proclaimed Northwestern Memorial's commitment to healing, caring, and serving our community with distinction. The irony was bitter and complete. Outside, the Chicago night was cold and unforgiving. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the building where she had dedicated the best years of her life to an ideal that had just been crushed beneath the weight of institutional greed. She had no job, no prospects, and a lawsuit hanging over her head that could destroy her financially for the rest of her life. But she had her integrity, and she had the knowledge that somewhere in the ICU above, a young man was breathing because she had chosen courage over compliance. As she walked away from Northwestern Memorial Hospital for what she believed would be the last time, Sarah Martinez had no way of knowing that her act of defiance had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the corruption she had witnessed and transform the very institution that had just discarded her. The young man whose life she had saved was about to wake up, and with his awakening would come revelations that would shake the foundations of power in Chicago and beyond. The real reckoning was still to come, and when it arrived, it would be Sarah Martinez who emerged victorious from the ruins of the system that had tried to destroy her. Justice was about to arrive wearing a hospital gown, and it would not be gentle with those who had chosen profit over human life. 3 days after the surgery that Sarah Martinez had risked everything to secure, the patient in ICU bed 7 began to stir. His eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the soft lighting of the intensive care unit, and for a moment he seemed disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Dr. Miguel Santos was making his morning rounds when the young man's vital signs indicated consciousness returning. He approached the bed with professional caution, noting the strong vital signs and good neurological responses that indicated a successful recovery. "Good morning," Dr. Santos said gently. "I'm Dr. Santos. You're at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. You've been unconscious for 3 days following head surgery. How are you feeling?" The patient's hand moved slowly to his head, feeling the bandages that covered the surgical site. His voice was hoarse from the breathing tube, but his words were clear and articulate. "Thank you," he said simply. "I remember falling, but everything after that is foggy." Dr. Santos nodded, making notes on his chart. "That's normal after a head injury. Your memory should return gradually. Can you tell me your name?" There was a long pause as the young man seemed to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected authority that caught Dr. Santos off guard. "Michael Thompson." The name hung in the air between them, innocuous enough until Dr. Santos processed the implications. Thompson. In Chicago, that name carried weight, specifically the weight of one of America's largest family fortunes. "Thompson," Dr. Santos repeated carefully. "As in Thompson Holdings." Michael's eyes met his directly, no longer showing the confusion of someone emerging from unconsciousness. Instead, there was a clarity and intelligence that spoke to careful consideration of what he was about to reveal. "Robert Thompson is my father," Michael confirmed quietly. Dr. Santos felt his world shift slightly on its axis. The homeless man that Sarah Martinez had fought to save, the patient that Dr. Morrison had been willing to transfer to die at a public hospital, was the son of one of Chicago's most powerful business magnates. The irony was staggering. "Mr. Thompson, doctor," Santos said, his professional composure masking his astonishment. "Do you understand that we had no identification for you? The hospital assumed you were homeless?" Michael finished with a rueful smile. "That wasn't an assumption, doctor. That's exactly what I've been for the past 2 years." As Michael's strength returned over the following hours, he began to tell his story to Dr. Santos and the ICU staff. It was a tale that would have seemed impossible, if not for the obvious sincerity with which he told it. 2 years earlier, Michael Thompson had been the heir apparent to Thompson Holdings, groomed from childhood to take over the family empire. But as he grew older, he had become increasingly uncomfortable with the company's business practices, the way they treated workers, the communities they displaced for development projects, and the casual disregard for human suffering that seemed to be an accepted part of doing business at that level. The breaking point had come during a board meeting where his father had described a plan to demolish a low-income housing complex in Chicago's South Side to build luxury condominiums. Hundreds of families would be displaced, many of them elderly or disabled, and the company had no plan for relocating them. "I told my father I couldn't be part of it," Michael explained to Dr. Santos during one of their conversations. "I said we had a moral obligation to these people, that we could afford to help them relocate or find alternative housing." He said business wasn't about morality. It was about profit. The argument had escalated into the kind of family fight that destroys relationships permanently. Michael had stormed out of the boardroom, out of the corporate headquarters, and ultimately out of his privileged life entirely. He had taken nothing but the clothes on his back and disappeared into the streets of Chicago. "I wanted to understand what it really meant to be powerless in this city," Michael continued. "I wanted to see the world from the perspective of the people my family's business decisions affected every day." For 2 years, he had lived as Michael Rodriguez, taking his mother's maiden name, sleeping in shelters, working day labor jobs, and experiencing firsthand the struggles of Chicago's homeless population. He had seen the way hospitals treated uninsured patients, the way police regarded anyone without a permanent address as expendable, and the countless small cruelties that society inflicted on its most vulnerable members. "The night I was injured, I had been walking home from a construction site where I'd worked a 16-hour shift," Michael explained. "I was exhausted, it was raining, and I slipped on some wet metal scaffolding near the underpass, hit my head on the concrete. Doctor." Santos listened to this remarkable story with growing amazement. "And your family has no idea where you've been?" Michael shook his head. "I let them think I had died or left the country. I wanted to make a clean break to see if I could survive on my own merits instead of riding on the Thompson name." As Michael's recovery progressed, he began asking questions about his treatment and the circumstances of his surgery. It was then that Dr. Santos told him about Sarah Martinez, the nurse who had fought the entire hospital administration to ensure he received proper care. "She risked her career for a homeless stranger," Dr. Santos explained. And she paid the price. Dr. Morrison fired her, and the hospital is suing her for the cost of your treatment. Michael's reaction was immediate and intense. They fired her for saving my life, for exceeding her authority and violating hospital protocol, Dr. Santos corrected. But yes, essentially for refusing to let you be transferred to die at a public hospital. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried a steely determination that reminded Dr. Santos that despite his humble appearance, this was still the son of one of America's most powerful businessmen. "I want to meet her," Michael said. "I need to thank her personally." Dr. Santos hesitated. "Michael, she doesn't know who you are. To her, you're still just a homeless man whose life she saved, and she's dealing with some serious personal and legal consequences right now. All the more reason I need to meet her," Michael replied firmly. "Doctor, this woman sacrificed everything to save the life of someone she thought had nothing to offer her in return. That kind of courage, that kind of compassion, it's exactly what's been missing from my life and my family's business." As Michael continued his recovery, he began to formulate a plan. The nurse who had risked everything to save him represented everything he had been searching for during his 2 years on the streets: genuine human decency, moral courage, and a willingness to fight for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. But first, he needed to reconnect with a world he had abandoned 2 years earlier. He needed to remember what it meant to wield the power of the Thompson name, and he needed to decide how to use that power to set things right. The young man who had lived as a homeless person for 2 years was about to reclaim his identity as the heir to one of America's largest fortunes. And when he did, Northwestern Memorial Hospital and everyone who had conspired to destroy Sarah Martinez would learn what real power looked like when it was guided by a conscience. The awakening was complete, and the reckoning was about to begin. Sarah Martinez sat in the cramped kitchen of her South Side apartment, surrounded by legal documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The Northwestern Memorial Hospital letterhead seemed to mock her from every page, demanding payment for medical procedures she had supposedly authorized without authority. $800,000. The number haunted her dreams and followed her through her waking hours like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had spent 3 sleepless nights researching bankruptcy law and trying to find legal aid attorneys willing to take on one of Chicago's most powerful hospitals. Her grandmother Rosa sat across from her at the small table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 78, Rosa had seen enough of life to know when the powerful were trying to crush the powerless, but even she seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. "Mija," Rosa said softly, "maybe you should call that lawyer again. The one who said he might be able to help." Sarah looked up from the papers, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and stress. "Abuela, he wants a $50,000 retainer just to start the case. We don't have $50,000. We don't have $5,000. The irony was bitter and complete. Sarah had dedicated her life to healing others, and now she couldn't even afford to defend herself against the institution she had served faithfully for 7 years. The system had turned against her with a vengeance that seemed almost personal in its cruelty. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was barely 8 in the morning, too early for the mail or any of their neighbors. She approached the door cautiously, recent events having made her wary of unexpected visitors. Through the peephole, she saw a well-dressed man in an expensive suit, holding what appeared to be a briefcase. Her heart sank. Process servers, debt collectors, or lawyers, none of the possibilities were good news. "Sarah Martinez?" the man asked when she opened the door. "Yes? My name is David Chen, and I represent Michael Thompson. May I come in? I believe we have some important matters to discuss." The name Michael Thompson meant nothing to Sarah, but the man's professional demeanor and obvious expense of his attire suggested this was serious business. She reluctantly invited him in, gesturing for him to sit at their small dining table. "Ms. Martinez," David Chen began, opening his briefcase and withdrawing a thick folder. "My client wanted me to personally thank you for saving his life 3 nights ago at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Sarah frowned in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Who is Michael Thompson?" "The young man you fought to get emergency neurosurgery for," David replied gently. "The patient that Dr. Morrison wanted to transfer to Cook County Hospital." Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. The homeless man. His name is Michael Thompson. Yes, and there's quite a bit more to the story, David continued. Ms. Martinez, are you familiar with Thompson Holdings? The name triggered a vague memory. Sarah had seen it in the business section of the Chicago Tribune, usually in connection with real estate development or corporate acquisitions. It's some kind of investment company, isn't it? One of the largest private investment firms in the United States, David corrected, with holdings in real estate, healthcare, technology, and dozens of other industries. Michael Thompson is the son and heir of Robert Thompson, the company's founder and CEO. The words seemed to hang in the air without meaning. Sarah stared at David Chen, trying to process what he was telling her. That's impossible. The man I treated was homeless. He had no identification, no money, no insurance. All true, David confirmed. Michael has been living on the streets of Chicago for the past 2 years, deliberately estranged from his family and fortune. He wanted to experience life from the perspective of the powerless, to understand what it meant to survive without privilege or connections. Rosa leaned forward, her eyes sharp with interest. And now? Now he wants to thank the woman who risked everything to save his life, David replied, turning his attention back to Sarah. Ms. Martinez, Michael is deeply grateful for your courage and compassion. More than that, he's outraged by what Northwestern Memorial has done to you in retaliation. Sarah felt dizzy, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. I don't understand what this means. David smiled, the expression transforming his professional demeanor into something warmer and more human. It means, Ms. Martinez, that your troubles with Northwestern Memorial Hospital are about to end. And it means that the people who tried to destroy you for doing the right thing are about to learn some very expensive lessons about justice. He withdrew a document from his briefcase and placed it on the table in front of Sarah. This is a check for $1 million, compensation for your wrongful termination and the emotional distress you've endured. Consider it a down payment on the changes that are about to take place. Sarah stared at the check, unable to process the reality of what she was seeing. $1 million, more money than she had ever imagined having, enough to pay any lawsuit and start a new life anywhere in the world. I can't accept this, she said finally. I was just doing my job. You were doing far more than your job, David replied firmly. You were upholding the highest principles of medical ethics in the face of institutional corruption. Michael wants to ensure that you're compensated for your courage, and he wants to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Rosa reached across the table and placed her hand over Sarah's. Mija, sometimes God sends angels in unexpected forms. This young man's life was saved by your compassion. Now he wants to save yours. David continued. Michael is planning to return to his family and his responsibilities at Thompson Holdings, but he wants to do it in a way that honors what you've taught him about moral courage and genuine compassion. What does that mean? Sarah asked. It means Northwestern Memorial Hospital is about to undergo some significant changes, David replied with a slight smile. Thompson Holdings has substantial investments in healthcare facilities throughout Chicago. When the board of directors learns about how this hospital treats uninsured patients and how they retaliate against medical professionals who try to provide appropriate care, well, let's just say there will be consequences. Sarah felt a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. I never asked for revenge. I just wanted to save a life. And you did, David said gently. But now it's time to make sure that other medical professionals can save lives without fear of retaliation. What happened to you was wrong, Ms. Martinez. It was a betrayal of everything that medicine is supposed to represent. As David Chen prepared to leave, he handed Sarah a business card with contact information for Thompson Holdings' legal department. Michael would like to meet with you personally when he's released from the hospital. He has a proposition that might interest you, something about reforming healthcare delivery for underserved populations. After David left, Sarah and Rosa sat in stunned silence, staring at the check on their kitchen table. Their small apartment suddenly felt different, as if the walls had expanded to accommodate possibilities they had never dared to imagine. Abuela, Sarah said quietly, what do you think I should do? Rosa's weathered face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Mija, I think you should get ready to change the world, because that's exactly what's about to happen. Outside their window, Chicago stretched toward the horizon, a city full of people who needed healing and hope. Sarah Martinez had saved one life 3 nights ago, not knowing that he would soon help her save thousands more. The revelation was complete, and the transformation was about to begin. The private room at Northwestern Memorial Hospital felt different now that Michael Thompson had revealed his true identity. Where once there had been the sterile efficiency of charity care, now there was the kind of solicitous attention reserved for VIP patients. Dr. Morrison himself had visited twice, his previous disdain replaced by the nervous courtesy of a man who suddenly realized he might have made a catastrophic error. Michael sat propped up in his hospital bed, holding a cell phone that David Chen had brought him along with fresh clothes and other necessities. The device felt foreign in his hands, after 2 years of deliberate disconnection from his privileged life, but the number he was about to dial was burned into his memory. 2 years. 24 months since he had walked out of his father's office and into voluntary exile on Chicago's streets. Now he was about to bridge that gap with a single phone call that would change everything for himself, for Sarah Martinez, and for the corrupt system that had tried to destroy her. He dialed the number and waited through 3 rings before a familiar voice answered. "Robert Thompson's office. This is Margaret speaking." Margaret. His father's personal secretary for the past 15 years, a woman who had remembered every birthday and graduation, who had scheduled countless family dinners that his father had been too busy to attend. "Hello, Margaret," Michael said, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "It's Michael." The silence that followed was so complete that Michael wondered if the call had been dropped. Then he heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath, followed by what sounded suspiciously like crying. "Michael? Oh my God, Michael, is it really you?" "It's really me, Margaret. I need to speak with my father. Is he available?" "Available?" "Michael, your father has been... He's been..." She struggled to compose herself. "He's been looking for you for 2 years. The private investigators, the FBI contacts, the international searches. He never gave up hope that you were alive." Michael felt a pang of guilt. In his determination to make a clean break from his privileged life, he had never considered how his disappearance might affect the people who cared about him. He had been so focused on his own moral awakening that he had forgotten about the human cost of his choices. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I know I should have called." "Is he in?" "He's in a board meeting, but Michael, for you he'll drop everything. Please hold on." The wait felt like an eternity, though it was probably less than 2 minutes. Michael could hear Margaret's excited voice in the background, muffled conversations, and then hurried footsteps approaching the phone. "Michael?" His father's voice was rougher than Michael remembered, aged by worry and stress in ways that 2 years shouldn't have accomplished. Robert Thompson, the man who commanded billion-dollar deals with casual authority, sounded fragile and uncertain. "Hello, Dad." Another silence, this one filled with the weight of 2 years of separation, anger, and fear. When Robert spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Son, where are you? Are you safe? Are you hurt?" "I'm in a hospital in Chicago," Michael replied, deciding that the full explanation could wait. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm going to be fine." "A hospital? What happened? Do you need money? Do you need help? I can have a medical team there in—" "Dad, stop!" Michael's voice carried the authority he had inherited but rarely used. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen. The way you used to when I was a kid and had something important to tell you." Robert Thompson, a man accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them, fell silent. "I've been living on the streets of Chicago for the past 2 years," Michael continued. "Homeless, working day labor jobs, sleeping in shelters. I wanted to understand what life was like for the people our business decisions affect every day." "Michael, what are you talking about? Why would you—" "Because I needed to learn something that our money and privilege never taught me," Michael interrupted. "I needed to understand what real courage looks like, what genuine compassion means, and what happens when powerful people use their influence to hurt the powerless." Michael paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life. "Dad, 3 days ago I was brought to Northwestern Memorial Hospital with a head injury. I was unconscious, had no identification, and the hospital assumed I was just another homeless person. They wanted to stabilize me and transfer me to a public hospital to die, rather than provide proper treatment." "But you're alive," Robert said, confusion evident in his voice. "I'm alive because a nurse named Sarah Martinez risked her career to make sure I got the surgery I needed. She fought the medical director, violated hospital protocols, and stood up to the entire system to save the life of someone she thought was worthless by society's standards. Michael could hear his father processing this information, the businessman's mind calculating implications and connections. And what happened to this nurse? They fired her. They're suing her for $800,000. They're trying to destroy her life because she chose to save mine. The silence that followed was different, not confused or emotional, but calculating. Michael recognized the sound of his father's mind shifting into the strategic mode that had built Thompson Holdings into a corporate empire. "What's the name of this hospital?" Robert asked, his voice taking on the cold edge that his business opponents had learned to fear. "Northwestern Memorial. The medical director is Dr. Charles Morrison and the nursing supervisor is Susan Miller. Dad, these people need to pay for what they've done." "Oh, they will," Robert replied, and Michael could hear the steel beneath the words. "Son, do you have any idea how much money Thompson Holdings has invested in Chicago's healthcare infrastructure?" Michael felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I was hoping you'd ask. We have controlling interests in 3 hospital systems, partnerships with 2 major medical device manufacturers, and consulting contracts with half the private medical practices in the city," Robert continued, his voice gathering momentum like a freight train. "Northwestern Memorial exists because we allow it to exist." "There's something else, Dad," Michael said. "The nurse who saved me, Sarah Martinez, she represents everything I was looking for during my time on the streets. Real integrity, genuine compassion, the courage to do what's right regardless of the cost. I want to help her, but more than that, I want to learn from her." Robert was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of pride that Michael hadn't heard in years. "You've grown up, haven't you? These 2 years, as much as they've terrified me, they've changed you into the man I always hoped you'd become." "They've taught me what really matters," Michael agreed. "And now I want to use everything we have, all our money, all our influence, all our power, to make sure that what happened to Sarah Martinez never happens to anyone else." "Then we'd better get started," Robert said, and Michael could hear the sound of his father's chair creaking as he leaned forward. "I'm going to make some phone calls. By the time you're released from that hospital, Northwestern Memorial is going to be under new management. And Dad?" "Yes, son? I want Sarah Martinez to be part of whatever we build next. She's the person who should be running hospitals, not people like Dr. Morrison." "Consider it done," Robert replied. "Michael, I've missed you more than you can imagine, and I'm proud of you. Proud of the man you've become, and proud of the choices you've made, even when they broke my heart." As Michael ended the call, he felt the weight of 2 years of exile lifting from his shoulders. He was no longer Michael Rodriguez, day laborer and homeless wanderer. He was Michael Thompson, heir to one of America's great fortunes, and he finally understood how to use that power responsibly. Outside his hospital room window, Chicago spread out beneath a gray November sky. Somewhere in the city, Sarah Martinez was probably sitting in her apartment, wondering how she was going to fight a legal system stacked against her. She had no way of knowing that powerful allies were already moving on her behalf, or that her act of courage had triggered a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but the entire landscape of healthcare in Chicago. The prodigal son had returned, and he was bringing justice with him. Dr. Charles Morrison arrived at his office Monday morning to find 3 men in expensive suits waiting outside his door. Their presence in the executive wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital at 7 a.m. suggested either very good news or very bad news, and their serious expressions indicated it wasn't the former. Dr. Morrison, the eldest of the 3, a distinguished man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, stepped forward. "I'm Robert Thompson. I believe we need to have a conversation." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. Robert Thompson, chairman and CEO of Thompson Holdings, one of the most powerful business figures in Chicago, and a man whose investment decisions could make or break entire industries. Morrison's mind raced through possible connections, trying to understand why such a powerful figure would be standing outside his office. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison managed, his voice betraying none of the panic he felt. "This is unexpected. How can I help you?" "You can start by inviting us into your office," Robert replied, his tone carrying the kind of polite menace that powerful men used when they were barely containing their anger. Morrison unlocked his office door with hands that were not quite steady. The 3 men filed in behind him, and he noticed that one of them remained by the door while the other two took seats across from his desk. The positioning was clearly intentional. These weren't visitors, they were predators, and he was their prey. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, settling behind his desk in an attempt to regain some sense of control, "I have to say this is highly irregular. If Thompson Holdings has business with the hospital, we have proper channels." "This isn't about business," Robert interrupted quietly. "This is about my son." Morrison's confusion was genuine. "Your son? I'm not sure I understand." 3 days ago, a young man was brought to your emergency room with severe head trauma," Robert continued, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "No identification, no insurance, no obvious means of support. What was your hospital's response?" The question triggered Morrison's memory, and he felt the first cold tendrils of real fear beginning to creep up his spine. "We followed standard protocol for indigent patients, stabilize and transfer to appropriate public facilities." "Except that transfer would have killed him," Robert said, his voice remaining conversational despite the rage that was clearly building beneath the surface. "And except that one of your nurses, Sarah Martinez, refused to allow it to happen." Morrison's mouth went dry. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not sure what you've been told, but Nurse Martinez violated direct orders, exceeded her authority, and cost this hospital hundreds of thousands of dollars in unauthorized procedures. That homeless man was my son, Dr. Morrison. Sarah Martinez saved my son's life." The words seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet office. Morrison felt the world tilt around him as the implications crashed through his consciousness like a tidal wave. The indigent patient he had been so eager to transfer, the homeless man whose life he had valued at zero, was the heir to one of America's largest fortunes. That's impossible," Morrison stammered. "Your son was living on the streets by his own choice for the past 2 years," Robert finished, "learning about life from the perspective of the powerless. Learning about what happens when people like you decide that human lives have different values based on their bank accounts." Morrison's training in hospital politics kicked in, and he attempted to shift to damage control mode. "Mr. Thompson, if you had known, you would have provided excellent care to save your own reputation," Robert interrupted. "But you didn't know, so you revealed your true character. You were willing to let my son die to save money." The second man, who had been silent until now, opened a briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Dr. Morrison, I'm James Patterson, lead counsel for Thompson Holdings. We've spent the weekend conducting a comprehensive investigation into the financial and ethical practices of Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Patterson placed the folder on Morrison's desk with the deliberate care of someone delivering a death sentence. "What we found is deeply disturbing. A pattern of discriminatory care based on insurance status, systematic violations of medical ethics, and a corporate culture that prioritizes profit over human life." Morrison stared at the folder without touching it, knowing that whatever was inside would be enough to destroy his career and possibly land him in prison. "Mr. Thompson, surely we can work something out. If there have been misunderstandings—" "The only misunderstanding," Robert said, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator preparing to strike, "is your assumption that you could mistreat vulnerable patients without consequences. Furthermore," Patterson continued, "your retaliation against Nurse Martinez, firing her and pursuing a frivolous lawsuit, represents such a flagrant violation of medical ethics and employment law that we're frankly amazed you thought you could get away with it." Morrison's last desperate attempt at self-preservation kicked in. "Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset, but Nurse Martinez clearly violated hospital protocol. If we allowed nurses to make independent medical decisions—" "She made the decision that any ethical healthcare professional should make," Robert snapped, his composure finally cracking. "She chose to save a human life rather than protect your profit margin, and for that act of basic human decency, you tried to destroy her." The third man, who had remained silent by the door, finally spoke. "Dr. Morrison, effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties at Northwestern Memorial Hospital pending a full investigation into your conduct. Security will escort you from the building." Morrison's eyes widened in shock. "You can't do this. I have contracts, board approval." "The board met in emergency session yesterday," Patterson explained calmly. "When they learned about Thompson Holdings' concerns regarding this institution, They were very eager to cooperate with our investigation. Your suspension was unanimous. As was the decision to terminate your employment, Robert added with satisfaction, along with nursing supervisor Susan Miller and several other staff members who participated in the discrimination against indigent patients. Morrison felt his world collapsing around him. This is illegal. You can't simply... Dr. Morrison, Robert interrupted, his voice carrying the cold authority of absolute power. You seem to have forgotten something important. Thompson Holdings has significant investments in Chicago's healthcare infrastructure. We have the power to make or break institutions like this one. And right now, Patterson added, we're very inclined to break it, completely. As security guards appeared in the doorway, Morrison made one last desperate plea. Mr. Thompson, please. I have a family, a career. I was just following standard business practices. You were following practices that valued money over human life, Robert replied coldly. And now you're going to learn what it feels like when someone with power decides your life doesn't matter. As Morrison was escorted from his office for the last time, Robert Thompson turned to Patterson with a look of grim satisfaction. What's the status on the rest of our plans? Sarah Martinez's lawsuit has been dismissed with prejudice, Patterson reported. The hospital will pay her a substantial settlement and issue a public apology, and the board has agreed to implement the new patient care protocols we discussed. Good, Robert said, looking out the window at the Chicago skyline. And the other matter? Your son's proposal for the new healthcare initiative. The board approved it unanimously. Sarah Martinez will be offered the position of Director of Patient Advocacy, with full authority to ensure that what happened to her never happens to anyone else. Robert smiled for the first time since learning about his son's injury. Michael had found his calling, and in doing so, he had found a way to transform their family's wealth into something that could heal rather than harm. The reckoning was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Northwestern Memorial Hospital was about to become something entirely new, a place where Sarah Martinez's values of compassion and justice would guide every decision. The revolution in healthcare had begun, and it started with a nurse who had chosen courage over compliance. The coffee shop on North Michigan Avenue was nothing special, a small, independent establishment that served decent coffee and minded its own business. But for Michael Thompson, it represented something profound. The first time in 2 years that he would meet someone not as a homeless man seeking charity, but as himself. Sarah Martinez arrived precisely on time, her professional punctuality intact, despite the chaos of the past week. She had traded her scrubs for civilian clothes, a simple blue dress that complemented her dark hair and highlighted the intelligence in her eyes. Michael watched her enter through the plate-glass window, noting how she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had first caught his attention in the emergency room. He had chosen a table in the back corner, partly for privacy, but mostly because he was nervous. How do you thank someone for saving your life? How do you explain that their act of courage had fundamentally changed not just your own existence, but your understanding of what it meant to be human? Sarah? He stood as she approached, extending his hand in greeting. She shook it with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. You look different, she said, settling into the chair across from him. Better. Michael laughed, running a hand through his clean hair. 2 years of careful grooming can be undone pretty quickly, but it takes a while to reverse the damage. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each taking measure of the other in this new context. Sarah studied his face, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the way he carried himself, subtle indicators of education and confidence that hadn't been visible when he was unconscious in a hospital bed. Your lawyer explained the situation, Sarah said finally. About who you are, about your family, I have to admit it's difficult to process. I imagine it is, Michael replied. 2 years ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in homeless shelters and working construction jobs, I wouldn't have believed them either. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression curious rather than judgmental. Why did you do it? Why give up everything to live on the streets? Michael had been asking himself the same question for months, and he still wasn't sure he had a complete answer. Have you ever felt like your life was fundamentally disconnected from reality? Like you were living in a bubble that protected you from understanding what the world was really like? Sarah considered this. I felt the opposite. Like I was pressed up against reality so hard that it was crushing me. That's what I was missing, Michael said with sudden understanding. I grew up in boardrooms and country clubs, surrounded by people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever having to face the consequences. I wanted to know what those consequences actually looked like. And what did you learn? Michael's expression grew serious. I learned that the healthcare system in this country is designed to profit from human suffering. I learned that hospitals like Northwestern Memorial view uninsured patients as problems to be disposed of rather than human beings to be healed. And I learned that it takes extraordinary courage to stand up to that system. It wasn't courage, Sarah said quietly. It was just the right thing to do. That's what made it courageous, Michael replied. How you knew exactly what it would cost you, and you did it anyway. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their coffee. As they waited for the server to leave, Sarah seemed to gather her thoughts for something she needed to say. Michael, I appreciate everything your family has done. The lawsuit being dropped, the settlement, the job offer. It's incredibly generous. But I need you to understand that I didn't save your life because I wanted a reward. I did it because it was my job as a nurse. I know, Michael said simply. That's what makes it so remarkable. You risked everything for a stranger who couldn't offer you anything in return. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Sarah shook her head. It shouldn't be rare, it should be normal. Every healthcare professional should be willing to put patient care ahead of politics or profit. But they don't, Michael pointed out. Most of them don't anyway. They follow orders, protect their careers and rationalize their compromises by telling themselves they're being practical. Sarah was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Is that what this is about? The job offer, the new healthcare initiative your father mentioned? Are you trying to fix the system? I'm trying to learn from you, Michael replied honestly. For 2 years, I've been searching for something real, something that mattered. When you stood up to Morrison and Miller, when you fought for my life even though you thought I was nobody, that was the most real thing I've ever witnessed. And now? Michael leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. Now I want to use everything I have, all the money, all the influence, all the power that comes with being a Thompson, to make sure that other healthcare professionals can do what you did without being destroyed for it. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the casual idealism that wealthy people sometimes mistook for genuine commitment. Instead, she saw something deeper, a determination born of real experience and hard-won understanding. The job offer, she said finally. Director of Patient Advocacy. What would that actually mean? It would mean transforming Northwestern Memorial from a place that values profit over patients into a place that puts healing first, Michael explained. It would mean establishing protocols that ensure every patient receives appropriate care, regardless of their ability to pay. It would mean creating a model that other hospitals could follow. And it would mean working with you. Michael nodded. If you're willing. I've spent 2 years learning about the problems with our healthcare system from the perspective of the powerless, but I need someone who understands those problems from the perspective of the professionals who actually provide care. Sarah was quiet for a long time, and Michael could see her weighing the implications of what he was proposing. She would be taking a massive risk, trusting her career and reputation to someone she barely knew, betting that the privileged son of a business magnate could truly understand the principles she had spent her life defending. There would have to be conditions, she said finally. Name them. Patient care always comes first, always. No matter what it costs, no matter how it affects the hospital's profit margins. Agreed. Medical decisions are made by medical professionals, not administrators or accountants. Absolutely. And the people who work at the hospital, the nurses, the technicians, the support staff, they get treated with the same respect as the doctors and executives. Michael smiled. Sarah, you're describing exactly the kind of place I want to help create. The question is, are you willing to help me build it? Sarah looked out the window at the busy street beyond, watching ordinary people going about their daily lives. Somewhere among them were future patients who would need advocates, healthcare workers who would need protection, and families who would need someone to fight for them when the system tried to grind them down. Yes, she said finally. I'm willing to try. As they shook hands across the small table, both of them understood that they were embarking on something much larger than a simple employment arrangement. They were forming a partnership that would challenge one of the most entrenched and profitable systems in American society. The nurse who had risked everything to save a life, and the heir who had given up everything to find meaning, had found each other at exactly the right moment. Together, they were about to prove that real change was possible when courage met power, and both were guided by conscience. The transformation of Northwestern Memorial Hospital was about to begin, and with it, a new model for healthcare that put humanity back at the center of healing. 6 weeks after Sarah Martinez walked back through the doors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the institution was barely recognizable. The changes weren't just cosmetic, though the addition of comfortable seating areas, multilingual signage, and artwork created by local community groups had certainly improved the atmosphere. The real transformation ran deeper, touching every aspect of how the hospital operated and whom it served. Sarah stood in what had once been Dr. Morrison's corner office, now converted into the Patient Advocacy Center. The panoramic view of Chicago's skyline remained the same, but everything else had been redesigned to reflect the center's mission. Comfortable chairs arranged in conversation circles rather than intimidating desk setups, medical reference books in multiple languages, and a prominent display of the new Patient Bill of Rights that guaranteed quality care regardless of insurance status. "The morning briefing is ready," announced Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been promoted to Chief Medical Officer following Morrison's departure. The respect in her voice was evident. Sarah's new position as Director of Patient Advocacy carried real authority, and the medical staff had quickly learned that her decisions were backed by the full weight of Thompson Holdings' influence. The briefing room buzzed with purposeful energy as department heads gathered around a conference table that had been specifically designed to encourage collaboration rather than hierarchy. Michael Thompson sat at one end, no longer the homeless man from the emergency room, but not quite the privileged heir either. He had found a middle ground that honored both his experiences and his responsibilities. "Let's start with the numbers," Sarah said, opening a folder that contained the kind of statistics that would have made Dr. Morrison apoplectic. "In the 6 weeks since we implemented the new protocols, we've seen a 43% increase in uninsured patients seeking treatment. And our cost overruns?" asked Dr. Patricia Williams, the new chief financial officer who had replaced Morrison's bean-counting predecessor. "Surprisingly minimal, Dr." Williams continued, answering her own question. "It turns out that providing appropriate care early prevents much more expensive emergency interventions later. Our overall costs are actually down 12%. Michael leaned forward with interest. "What's driving that improvement?" Dr. Rodriguez consulted her notes. "Early intervention, primarily. When we treat patients appropriately the first time they come in, we prevent the kinds of complications that require expensive emergency surgery or extended ICU stays." Sarah smiled with satisfaction. "It's almost as if providing good health care is actually good business." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The cost-cutting measures that Morrison had championed in the name of fiscal responsibility had actually been driving up expenses by creating a cycle of inadequate care followed by emergency interventions. "What about staff morale?" Michael asked Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had emerged as a leader among the medical staff following Morrison's departure. "Dramatically improved," Dr. Walsh reported. "When healthcare professionals can actually focus on healing rather than navigating administrative obstacles, job satisfaction goes up significantly. Our turnover rate is at an all-time low." Sarah had seen the change herself in the halls and patient rooms. Nurses who had previously seemed beaten down by the system now walked with renewed purpose. Doctors spent more time with patients and less time documenting justifications for cost-cutting administrators. The entire culture of the hospital had shifted from defensive cynicism to proactive compassion. "There is one concern," Dr. Rodriguez added carefully. "We're getting some pushback from other hospitals in the area. They're worried that our new patient care standards will create pressure for them to change their own practices." Michael's expression hardened. "What kind of pushback?" "Subtle at first," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Questioning our medical decisions, spreading rumors about financial instability, suggesting that our approach isn't sustainable. But yesterday, Dr. Elizabeth Harper from Chicago General called to express concerns about our unrealistic standards affecting industry expectations." Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. the same fury she had experienced when watching Morrison prioritize profits over patients. They're worried that treating patients with dignity and providing appropriate care might become the expected standard, rather than the exception. Let them worry, Michael said firmly. If our success makes other hospitals uncomfortable, that's their problem. We're not here to maintain the status quo. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Margaret, who had transitioned from being Robert Thompson's secretary to serving as Michael's administrative coordinator, entered with an expression of barely contained excitement. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's someone here who insists on speaking with Sarah personally, a Mrs. Elena Reyes." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The name was familiar, painfully so. Elena Reyes was the widow of Manuel Reyes, the construction worker who had died after being transferred from Northwestern Memorial to Cook County Hospital during the previous year's flu outbreak. "Should I tell her you're in a meeting?" Margaret asked, noting Sarah's reaction. "No," Sarah said, standing up. "I'll see her immediately." The Patient Advocacy Center's main room had been designed to be welcoming, rather than institutional, but Sarah still felt nervous as she approached the small woman waiting by the window. Elena Reyes was probably in her 50s, though grief and hardship had aged her beyond her years. She clutched a worn purse with both hands and wore the kind of carefully maintained clothing that spoke of pride maintained despite financial struggle. "Mrs. Reyes," Sarah said gently. "I'm Sarah Martinez. How can I help you?" Elena's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Sarah. "You're the nurse? The one who's changing everything here?" "I'm just trying to make sure that patients get the care they need," Sarah replied carefully. "My husband," Elena said, her voice breaking slightly, "Manuel, he died last year after they sent him away from here. The doctors said he was too sick to move, but they moved him anyway because we couldn't pay." Sarah felt the weight of that tragedy settling on her shoulders. She had been working at the hospital when Manuel Reyes died, had seen the callous indifference with which his case had been handled, and had been powerless to prevent it. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Sarah said. "Your husband should have received better care." Eleanor reached into her purse and withdrew a folded newspaper clipping. "I read about what you did, how you fought for someone even when you knew it would cost you your job. I wanted to thank you. Mrs. Reyes, you don't need to thank me. I wish I could have done more for your husband." "You couldn't then," Eleanor agreed. "But you can now. That's why I came." She paused, gathering her courage for what she needed to say. "My son Roberto, he works construction like his father did. No insurance, just like we never had. He's been putting off seeing a doctor about chest pains because he's afraid of what happened to Manuel." Sarah felt her purpose crystallizing with perfect clarity. This was why the changes at Northwestern Memorial mattered. Not for the statistics or the administrative satisfaction, but for families like the Reyes family who needed to know that healthcare was about healing rather than profit. "Mrs. Reyes," Sarah said firmly, "bring Roberto in today, this afternoon if possible. He'll receive the best possible care, and you won't receive a bill you can't afford." Elena's tears flowed freely now. "You promise? You promise he won't be turned away?" "I promise," Sarah said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "That's exactly why we're here." As Elena Reyes left the hospital with hope in her eyes for the first time since her husband's death, Sarah felt the true measure of what they had accomplished. The statistics and protocols were important, but the real transformation was measured in individual lives saved and families given hope. Michael found her standing by the window, watching Elena walk toward the bus stop with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there when she arrived. "How do you feel?" he asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. 6 weeks ago, she had been facing financial ruin and professional exile for the crime of saving a life. Now she was directing the transformation of one of Chicago's most prestigious hospitals with the authority to ensure that tragedies like Manuel Reyes' death never happened again. "Like we're just getting started," she said finally. Michael smiled. "Good. Because my father has been in touch with hospital administrators in New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. They want to know more about the Northwestern Memorial model." Sarah felt a thrill of possibility. If they could replicate their success in other cities, if they could prove that compassionate care was not only ethically right but financially sound, they could transform healthcare across the entire country. The nurse who had risked everything to save one life was about to save thousands more, and the heir who had lost himself in privilege had found his purpose in service to others. The revolution was spreading, one hospital at a time. The auditorium at the Chicago Medical Convention Center hummed with anticipation as over 800 healthcare professionals settled into their seats for the keynote presentation that had become the most talked-about session of the American Hospital Association's annual conference. The title on the program was simple: The Northwestern Memorial Model, Proving that Compassionate Care is Good Business. Sarah Martinez stood backstage, adjusting the lapel microphone that would carry her voice to an audience that included some of the most powerful healthcare administrators in the United States. 6 months ago, she had been fired from her nursing job for violating protocol. Today, she was about to address the industry leaders who set those protocols. 5 minutes, Ms. Martinez, the stage manager announced. Sarah nodded, taking deep breaths to calm the nervous energy that always preceded public speaking. She had given variations of this presentation dozens of times over the past 3 months, but never to an audience this influential or potentially hostile. Michael Thompson appeared at her elbow, wearing the kind of perfectly tailored suit that marked him as a member of America's business elite, but carrying himself with the humility he had learned during his years on Chicago's streets. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I'm about to tell a room full of hospital administrators that everything they believe about healthcare economics is wrong," Sarah replied with a nervous laugh. "Good," Michael said with a grin. "Because that's exactly what you're about to do." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of success and controversy. Northwestern Memorial's transformation had exceeded every expectation. Patient satisfaction scores had skyrocketed. Medical outcomes had improved dramatically. And despite providing care to thousands of previously unserved patients, the hospital's financial performance had actually strengthened. But success had brought scrutiny, and scrutiny had brought opposition. The American Hospital Administrators Association had published several papers questioning the sustainability of Northwestern Memorial's approach. Medical economics journals had run articles suggesting that the hospital's success was due to the unique financial backing of Thompson Holdings rather than any fundamental improvement in care delivery. Most challenging of all, several competing hospitals had lobbied state regulators to investigate whether Northwestern Memorial's policies constituted unfair competition by providing services below cost. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcement from the stage, "please welcome Sarah Martinez, Director of Patient Advocacy at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Sarah walked onto the stage to polite but restrained applause. The audience was clearly waiting to see whether she could justify the claims that had been made about Northwestern Memorial's revolutionary approach to healthcare delivery. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 8 months ago, I was fired from Northwestern Memorial Hospital for violating protocol, specifically for insisting that a patient with a life-threatening head injury receive appropriate treatment instead of being transferred to die at a public hospital. The audience stirred at this blunt opening. Sarah had chosen to start with controversy rather than ease into it, and the strategy was clearly working. "Today, I'm here to tell you that the protocol I violated was not just ethically wrong, it was economically stupid." She clicked to her first slide, which showed Northwestern Memorial's financial performance over the past 6 months compared to the same period the previous year. Under our new patient care model, Northwestern Memorial has seen a 38% increase in patient volume, a 47% improvement in patient satisfaction scores, and a 12% reduction in overall costs. Murmurs rippled through the audience. These weren't the kinds of numbers that healthcare administrators were accustomed to seeing when hospitals expanded their charity care. "How is this possible?" Sarah continued. "The answer is simple. When you provide appropriate care the first time, you prevent expensive complications later. When you treat patients with dignity and respect, they trust you enough to seek care early rather than waiting until their conditions become critical." She clicked to the next slide, showing before and after statistics for emergency room visits, ICU admissions, and average length of stay. Under the old model, Northwestern Memorial was trapped in a cycle of expensive crisis intervention. Patients without insurance would avoid seeking care until their conditions became life-threatening, then present to our emergency room in critical condition, requiring extended ICU stays and complex surgical interventions. Dr. William Hendricks, the president of Chicago General Hospital, raised his hand from the audience. Ms. Martinez, those numbers are impressive, but surely they reflect the unusual financial backing that Northwestern Memorial enjoys. Most hospitals can't afford to provide unlimited charity care. Sarah had been expecting this challenge. Dr. Hendricks, I think you're misunderstanding our approach. We're not providing unlimited charity care. We're providing appropriate care and finding ways to make it financially sustainable. She clicked to a new slide showing Northwestern Memorial's charity care budget compared to other hospitals in the Chicago area. Our actual charity care expenditures are only 11% higher than the industry average, but our health outcomes for uninsured patients are 63% better. The difference isn't how much we spend, it's how intelligently we spend it. Can you give us a specific example? Asked Dr. Maria Santos from the audience. Sarah smiled. Absolutely. Roberto Reyes, a 28-year-old construction worker with no insurance, came to our emergency room with chest pains. Under the old protocol, he would have been given a basic EKG, told his results were inconclusive, and sent home with instructions to follow up with a private physician he couldn't afford. The audience was listening intently now. This was the kind of case they dealt with daily. Instead, we did a full cardiac workup and discovered early-stage cardiomyopathy. We started him on medication that costs $18 a month and enrolled him in our cardiac monitoring program. Total cost of intervention, approximately $1,500. Sarah paused for effect. 6 months later, Roberto is back at work, supporting his family, and his heart condition is stable. Under the old model, he would have returned to our ER 6 weeks later, in full cardiac arrest, requiring emergency surgery, a week in the ICU, and months of rehabilitation. Cost, approximately $300,000. The mathematical elegance of the argument was undeniable. Even the most profit-focused administrators could understand that preventing a $300,000 crisis with a $1,500 intervention was good business. Furthermore, Sarah continued, Roberto now trusts our hospital enough to bring his family here for routine care. His wife, his children, his extended family, they're all now patients who feel comfortable seeking early intervention rather than waiting for emergencies. Dr. Hendricks tried again. That's one case. Surely you can't extrapolate. We have over 4,000 similar cases, Sarah interrupted, clicking to a slide that showed detailed outcomes data. Every month, we prevent dozens of medical crises through early intervention. Every prevented crisis saves us an average of $87,000 in emergency costs. She looked out at the audience, noting the mix of skepticism and genuine interest on their faces. But the real transformation isn't financial. It's cultural. When healthcare professionals can focus on healing rather than rationing care, when they can make medical decisions based on patient needs rather than insurance status, they become more effective at their jobs. The slide changed to show staff turnover rates, productivity measures, and job satisfaction scores. Our nursing turnover is down 43%. Our physician recruitment is up 61%. When word gets out that a hospital truly puts patients first, the best medical professionals want to work there. A woman in the front row raised her hand. Ms. Martinez, this all sounds wonderful in theory, but what about the political reality? How do you deal with competition from hospitals that are willing to cut corners to maintain profit margins? Sarah's expression grew serious. That's the real challenge, isn't it? As long as hospitals are rewarded for providing minimal care and penalized for providing excellent care, the system will continue to fail patients. But here's what we're learning, she continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Patients aren't stupid. They recognize quality care when they receive it, and they tell other people about it. Word of mouth is the most powerful marketing tool in healthcare. She clicked to her final slide, which showed Northwestern Memorial's reputation scores compared to other hospitals in the Chicago area. In 8 months, we've gone from being seen as just another expensive hospital to being recognized as the place people want to go when they need healing. Our patient referrals are up 112%, including referrals from patients who have excellent insurance and could go anywhere. Sarah looked out at the audience of healthcare administrators, seeing the mix of inspiration and resistance that she had come to expect. Ladies and gentlemen, the choice is simple. We can continue to run hospitals as profit centers that happen to provide medical care, or we can run them as healing centers that happen to be financially sustainable. The Northwestern Memorial model proves that compassionate care isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. The applause that followed was more than polite. It was genuinely enthusiastic, though Sarah noticed that some administrators remained seated with their arms folded. Change would not come easily to an industry built on the premise that healthcare was a commodity to be sold, rather than a service to be provided. As Sarah left the stage, she felt the weight of possibility settling on her shoulders. Every person in that audience would return to their own hospital with the knowledge that there was a better way to provide healthcare. Some would implement changes immediately. Others would resist until competitive pressure forced them to act, but the seed had been planted. The revolution in American healthcare had begun in the ICU of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, with one nurse's refusal to let a patient die for lack of insurance. Now it was spreading across the country, one administrator at a time, one hospital at a time, one patient at a time. The transformation was no longer about Northwestern Memorial. It was about proving that healing could triumph over profit in an industry that had forgotten its fundamental purpose. The emergency call came at 3:17 a.m. on a frigid February morning, jolting Sarah Martinez awake in her Lincoln Park apartment. As Director of Patient Advocacy at Northwestern Memorial, she was accustomed to middle-of-the-night crises, but the urgency in Dr. Rodriguez's voice suggested something extraordinary. "Sarah, we need you here immediately," Dr. Rodriguez said without preamble. "We have a situation that's going to test everything we've built." 20 minutes later, Sarah rushed through the emergency department doors to find a scene of controlled chaos. The waiting room was packed with families clutching injured children, and the air crackled with the kind of desperate energy that followed catastrophic events. "What happened?" Sarah asked Dr. Rodriguez as they hurried toward the trauma bays. "School bus accident on the Dan Ryan," Dr. Rodriguez replied grimly. 43 children from Lincoln Elementary, plus the driver. Multiple serious injuries, several critical cases requiring immediate surgery. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Lincoln Elementary served one of Chicago's poorest neighborhoods, children whose families had no insurance, no financial resources, and no political influence. Under the old Northwestern Memorial protocols, these patients would have been stabilized and transferred to Cook County Hospital, regardless of their injuries. "How many are critical?" Sarah asked. 12 requiring immediate surgery, another 8 needing intensive monitoring, Dr. Rodriguez answered as they entered the trauma bay. "Sarah, this is going to cost us over $2 million in emergency interventions." The hospital board is already asking questions. Through the observation window, Sarah could see the controlled urgency of medical professionals doing what they did best, fighting to save lives without regard for anything except their patients' needs. Dr. Miguel Santos was prepping one child for emergency neurosurgery, while across the hall, Dr. Jennifer Walsh worked to stabilize a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "Where's Michael?" Sarah asked. "Conference call with the board," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "They're demanding answers about financial exposure, insurance verification, transfer protocols. There are people on that board who still think the old way was more practical." Sarah felt the familiar fire of determination rising in her chest. This was the moment they had been building toward, the ultimate test of whether Northwestern Memorial's transformation was real or simply cosmetic. 43 children's lives would prove whether they had truly changed or were just better at managing public relations. "Dr. Rodriguez," Sarah said firmly, "every child in this hospital gets the best possible care, period. No transfers, no corners cut, no decisions based on insurance status." "Sarah, I agree completely, but—" "No buts," Sarah interrupted. "This is exactly why we changed the system. These children don't get to choose their insurance status, and they don't get to choose whether or not to be in bus accidents. But they do get to count on us to heal them." Dr. Rodriguez nodded, relief evident in her expression. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already told the surgical teams to proceed with whatever interventions are necessary." As Sarah made her way through the trauma bays, she was struck by the intensity of the medical response. Every available surgeon had been called in, additional nursing staff was arriving to handle the overflow, and the entire hospital had mobilized around the simple principle that children's lives mattered more than budget considerations. In Trauma Bay 3, she found a scene that crystallized everything she had been fighting for. A young boy, probably 10 years old, lay unconscious while Dr. Santos examined the head injury that would require immediate surgery. Standing beside the bed was a woman in her 30s, still wearing the housekeeping uniform that suggested she had been pulled away from a night shift job. "Ma'am," Sarah approached the woman gently. "I'm Sarah Martinez, Director of Patient Advocacy. How is your son?" The woman, her name tag read Maria Gonzalez, looked up with eyes red from crying. "They say he needs brain surgery. They say it's very expensive." Her English was heavily accented, and Sarah could hear the fear beneath the words. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Sarah said in fluent Spanish, switching to the woman's native language, "your son is going to receive the best possible care. Don't worry about the cost. Worry about his recovery." Maria's tears flowed harder. "I clean offices downtown. No insurance. I can't pay for brain surgery." Sarah took the woman's hands in her own. "Mrs. Gonzalez, listen to me carefully. Your son will receive exactly the same care as if he were the child of the richest family in Chicago. The surgeons working on him are the best in the city, and they're going to save his life. But the money is our problem, not yours," Sarah said firmly. "Your job is to be here for your son when he wakes up. Our job is to make sure he wakes up healthy." As Dr. Santos prepared to take Maria's son to surgery, Sarah felt someone approaching behind her. She turned to find Michael Thompson, still wearing the suit from his emergency board meeting, his expression grim. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked. "Bad," Michael replied quietly. "The board is in full panic mode. They're talking about our fiscal responsibilities and suggesting that we should transfer the most critical cases to public hospitals." Sarah felt her jaw clench. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that if they wanted to abandon everything we've built for the sake of avoiding a $2 million expense, they could find a new healthcare partner," Michael said with quiet intensity. "Thompson Holdings has invested over $50 million in this transformation. We're not going to throw it away because some board members got nervous." "And their response?" Michael's smile was grim but determined. "They backed down. Barely. But Sarah, this is exactly what our critics have been waiting for. If even one of these children has a bad outcome, if the total costs run higher than projected, they're going to use it as proof that our model is unsustainable." Sarah looked around the trauma bay, at the controlled chaos of medical professionals doing everything possible to save 43 young lives. "Then we'd better make sure every single one of these children gets the best possible outcome." Over the next 18 hours, Northwestern Memorial Hospital became a testament to everything that was right about American healthcare when it functioned as it should. Surgeons worked in shifts to perform delicate operations on children whose injuries ranged from broken bones to traumatic brain injuries. Nurses provided round-the-clock monitoring and comfort to both patients and terrified families. Social workers helped coordinate with schools and community organizations to support the families during their crisis. And through it all, Sarah Martinez moved between patient rooms, family waiting areas and administrative offices, ensuring that the principles she had fought to establish remained paramount. No child would be denied care because of their insurance status. No family would be bankrupted by medical bills they couldn't afford. No administrator would be allowed to compromise patient care for budgetary concerns. The media attention was intense and immediate. Local news crews set up outside the hospital, and by noon, national outlets were covering the story of how Northwestern Memorial was handling its biggest test since the controversial transformation began. "This is exactly what we've been working toward," Sarah told a reporter from CNN. "A hospital system that responds to medical crises with medical solutions rather than financial calculations. These children are alive because our medical teams could focus on healing instead of billing." But the real test came 3 days later, when all 43 children had been stabilized and the final cost calculations were complete. The bill for emergency care, surgery, and follow-up treatment was $2.3 million, money that would have to be absorbed by the hospital since most of the families had no insurance. The board meeting that followed was tense and contentious, with several members questioning whether the hospital could sustain such expenses. But Michael Thompson's response was unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the room with the authority that came from both his family's influence and his moral conviction, "we just saved 43 children's lives. If anyone in this room thinks that was the wrong decision, they're welcome to explain their position to the parents waiting in our ICU." The silence that followed was electric. No one was prepared to argue that children should have been denied care for financial reasons. "Furthermore," Michael continued, "the national media coverage of our response has been uniformly positive. We've received inquiries from 57 hospitals around the country asking for guidance on implementing similar protocols. The value of that publicity alone exceeds our costs for this emergency." Sarah felt a wave of pride and relief. They had passed the ultimate test, proving that Northwestern Memorial's transformation was real, sustainable, and morally unshakable. The nurse who had risked her career to save one life had now presided over the saving of 43 lives, and in doing so, had proven that healthcare guided by compassion rather than profit was not just possible, but superior in every measurable way. The revolution was complete. Now came the work of spreading it to every hospital in America. 1 year later, the bronze statue unveiled outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital depicted a nurse in scrubs, her hand reaching out in a gesture of healing and compassion. The inscription at its base read simply, "To the healthcare professionals who choose courage over compliance, may their example light the way for all who follow." Sarah Martinez stood before the statue with a mixture of pride and humility, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the transformation of American healthcare that had begun in this very building. The dedication ceremony marked not just the anniversary of her stand against institutional injustice, but the culmination of changes that had spread France, the nurse who changed everything. Story conclusion. Chapter 14, The Legacy, continued. 1 year later, the bronze statue unveiled outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital depicted a nurse in scrubs, her hand reaching out in a gesture of healing and compassion. The inscription at its base read simply, "To the healthcare professionals who choose courage over compliance, may their example light the way for all who follow." Sarah Martinez stood before the statue with a mixture of pride and humility, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the transformation of American healthcare that had begun in this very building. The dedication ceremony marked not just the anniversary of her stand against institutional injustice, but the culmination of changes that had spread far beyond Chicago's city limits. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor of Chicago announced from the podium, "it gives me great pleasure to introduce the woman whose courage has literally saved thousands of lives and transformed healthcare delivery across our nation, Sarah Martinez." The applause was thunderous, but Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from her single act of defiance. As she approached the microphone, she could see faces in the crowd that told the story of the past year. Dr. Sy. Elena Rodriguez, now leading the National Healthcare Reform Initiative. Roberto Reyes, healthy and working thanks to early cardiac intervention. Elena Reyes, whose son's chest pains had been successfully treated, and dozens of other patients whose lives had been saved by the new protocols. "Thank you," Sarah began, her voice carrying across the plaza, "but I need to correct something. This statue shouldn't honor just one person. It should honor every healthcare professional who has ever chosen to put patient care ahead of profit, who has ever fought the system to save a life, who has ever believed that healing is more important than billing." She paused, looking out at the crowd that included reporters from national news networks, hospital administrators from across the country, and medical students who had traveled to Chicago to see the place where the healthcare revolution began. 1 year ago, I made a decision that I thought would end my career. I refused to let a patient die because he couldn't pay for treatment. That decision cost me my job, nearly bankrupted me, and made me enemies among the most powerful people in Chicago's medical establishment. But it also saved a life. And that life, Michael Thompson's life, became the catalyst for changes that have now transformed healthcare delivery in over 200 hospitals across the United States. Michael stepped forward from the crowd, no longer the heir trying to find his purpose, but a leader who had successfully merged business acumen with social conscience. Over the past year, he had spearheaded the creation of the Thompson Foundation for Healthcare Equity. which provided funding and expertise to hospitals willing to adopt the Northwestern Memorial model. "The numbers tell an incredible story," Sarah continued. "Hospitals that have implemented our patient-first protocols have seen an average 35% improvement in health outcomes, a 28% reduction in emergency interventions, and a 17% decrease in overall costs. Compassionate care isn't just morally right, it's economically superior." Dr. Miguel Santos, now the chief of surgery at the newly renamed Sarah Martinez Medical Center, approached the podium with a folder of documents. "Sarah, before you continue, there's something we need to share with everyone here." Sarah looked at him questioningly as he opened the folder. "This morning, we received notification that the American Medical Association has voted to establish the Sarah Martinez Award for Healthcare Courage, an annual recognition for medical professionals who demonstrate exceptional moral leadership in patient advocacy." The crowd erupted in applause, but Dr. Santos wasn't finished. "Furthermore, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has announced that hospitals adopting verified patient-first protocols will receive enhanced reimbursement rates, making compassionate care financially advantageous on a national scale." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. What had begun as one nurse's refusal to let a patient die had become a fundamental shift in how American healthcare operated. "But the real measure of our success," Sarah said, regaining her composure, "isn't in the awards or the policy changes. It's in the lives we've saved and the families we've kept together." She gestured toward the crowd, where Maria Gonzalez stood with her son, the boy who had required emergency brain surgery after the school bus accident. The child was healthy, laughing with friends, completely recovered from his injuries. It's in workers like Roberto Reyes, who can now support his family because we treated his heart condition before it became fatal. It's in the 237 hospitals that have transformed their practices, the 14,000 healthcare professionals who have found renewed purpose in their calling, and the 500,000 patients who have received better care because we proved that a different way was possible. As Sarah spoke, she noticed Michael moving through the crowd toward the podium. It's in children like Miguel Gonzalez, who received world-class neurosurgery, not because his mother could afford it, but because we believed he deserved it. In his hand was a small velvet box that made her heart skip a beat. "There's one more thing," Michael said as he joined her at the microphone. "Sarah, when you saved my life in that emergency room, you didn't just give me back my health. You gave me back my purpose, my direction, and my understanding of what it means to use privilege responsibly." The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. "You showed me that real power isn't about money or influence. It's about the courage to do what's right when everything and everyone is telling you to do what's easy." Michael dropped to one knee, opening the small box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "Sarah Martinez, you've already changed the world. Would you do me the honor of letting me help you change it even more? Will you marry me?" The plaza erupted in cheers as Sarah looked down at the man who had started as her patient and become her partner in transforming American healthcare. Through her tears, she saw not just Michael Thompson, heir to a business empire, but the homeless man who had trusted her with his life and then used his recovery to trust her with his heart. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying across the plaza through the microphone. "Yes, absolutely, yes." As Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the weight of the past year settling into perspective. She had lost a job and gained a calling. She had faced institutional opposition and emerged as a national leader. She had saved one life and ended up transforming thousands more. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor announced as the couple embraced, "I think it's safe to say that this is what justice looks like when courage meets opportunity." The celebration continued late into the evening, but as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing quietly with Michael before the bronze statue that bore no name but somehow captured her likeness perfectly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just followed protocol that night?" Michael asked, taking her hand in his. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes, but then I remember what my grandmother always told me. When someone is suffering, you help. Period. Everything else flows from that simple truth." And now? Sarah looked around at the hospital that had once fired her and now bore her name, at the city that had once ignored her and now celebrated her courage, at the healthcare system that had once seemed immutable and was now being transformed by the principles she had fought to defend. "Now we keep going," she said with quiet determination. There are still hospitals that prioritize profit over patients, still healthcare professionals who are afraid to speak up, still families who can't afford the care they need. Our work is just beginning. Michael smiled, seeing in her eyes the same fierce compassion that had first drawn him to her. "Then we'd better get started." The Sarah Martinez Medical Center for Healthcare Innovation breaks ground next month, and we have 50 more hospitals ready to implement our protocols by the end of the year. As they walked hand in hand toward the future they would build together, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as a nurse from the South Side who believed that every life had value. She was ending as a national leader who had proven that belief could transform systems, institutions, and entire industries. The bronze statue watched over them as they disappeared into the Chicago night, its outstretched hand forever reaching toward those who needed healing. Its silent presence a reminder that courage, once awakened, could change the world. Behind them, the lights of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, now the Sarah Martinez Medical Center, glowed against the darkness, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever believed that healthcare should be about healing rather than profit, that human dignity should triumph over institutional indifference, and that sometimes the smallest person in the room really can move the biggest mountains. The revolution was complete, but the legacy would endure forever. And somewhere in Chicago, in a small apartment on the South Side, an elderly woman named Rosa Martinez smiled as she watched her granddaughter on the evening news, knowing that the values she had taught about helping others had grown into something that would heal the world. The nurse who had risked everything to save one life had become the leader who saved thousands. The underdog had become the champion. The system had been transformed. And love, true, genuine, courageous love, and had conquered all. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.